Hi everyone, this is Brett Hancock. Just got some thoughts here I thought I'd share with everybody. I was just thinking about, I was talking with a brother this week and we were discussing different, messianic prophecies, different things. Anyway, he quoted this one from Psalms 41. I guess I'd never noticed it before. Starting in verse 9, it starts laying out what would be a prophecy, a couple of verses there clearly about Judas Iscariot, right? And so it talks about how he shared my bread and about how he lifted up his heel against me. And I was just thinking about that. It's like first he's sharing bread, and Jesus even told the disciple that he loved there in John chapter 13, I think it is, where it says the one that I dip my bread in and he dips in with me, that's the one that will betray me. So anyway, so he shared his bread with them, fulfillment of that prophecy. And then it says they lift up his heel against him. Well, Jesus washed all their feet. And of course, I can just imagine sitting down there and Jesus starts to wash my feet. I'm going to lift my heel up, But of course, it's against him because in his heart, he already had made plans to betray him and stuff or whatever. So I was just thinking about that. And I thought I would just share that in this writing, it's dated about 180. It's called Demonstration of Apostolic Preaching by a man that was a second-generation disciple, a second-generation student of the Apostle John. His name was Irenaeus. And so it's basically the Apostle John. He died, according to church history, about 100 AD. And then his disciple, Polycarp, who died as a martyr, died roughly about 157. And then this man is writing this writing about 180. So Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. So when Irenaeus says the reason why Judas did that was just because when Jesus rebukes him, because of that whole scenario in the Gospel of John, and it's mentioned in some other Gospels, but it doesn't actually say in every one that it was Judas that did this. It kind of leaves it vague in some of the Gospels. But in John, it makes it pretty clear. So, and it's the scenario where, Mary, so grateful that she had her brother alive again, that Jesus had raised him from the dead. Lazarus, her brother, on the fourth day, raised him up. And so she's washing his feet with perfume, very expensive perfume, as Judas points out, and says, hey, we could use this money to feed the poor and stuff, whatever. And Jesus, rebukes him, sets him straight, and basically, it ticks him off. So Irenaeus is describing that's why he threw Jesus under the bus. And of course, later on, it was just kind of reflecting on, it's very typical even in my past life when I used to give in to all those, fleshly passions like intemperance and anger and stuff, whatever, that, you feel bad later. And maybe, you go into a rage or you go and do some heinous thing, and then later on you feel bad and you're like, man, I shouldn't have done that and whatever. And that's our moral conscience. That's our spirit within us, God-given, made in God's image, so basically just reflecting on that, how, Jesus says, unless you take up your cross, deny yourself, deny those passions, because Paul talks about that, walking with the flesh, with fleshy passions, and Romans and Galatians and different epistles of his, and he contrasts between walking with the flesh, which leads to death, or walking with the Spirit by putting the flesh to death. And that's what Jesus says. If you don't take up your cross and deny yourself, put those fleshes, that flesh to death, those passions, that intemperance, because that's what a lot of the scriptures say. It's some English translation will say temperance, which some other translations, more modern, would use a word that we typically use nowadays, which is self-control. And so self-control or temperance, that is by doing those things that we resist the devil and he flees. So whatever that demon comes upon us and tries, it's the day of evil, like Ephesians 6 is talking about, put on the full armor of God, that, by us exercising that self-control, taking up our cross, that that the demon flees. Now it might be a while, that test might go on for a while because we're being tested, our faith is being tested, and so this is the sanctification process that God brings by us overcoming. And so by us giving God victory in that, almost a picture of the Old Testament of Israel going to war against the enemy. It's us putting on our full armor of God. It's like Paul says in Romans chapter 8, we don't war against flesh and blood, but against the principalities of the air, basically the kingdom of darkness. And so that's what we do. So I just wanted to share that was the reason, according to Irenaeus, very reliable source, of why Judas did that, and for us to basically learn from that, to not give in to that. And I guess one last passage I'll share is to kind of put this in context of what Paul was talking about. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10 and 11. It talks about what I've already discussed here, and that is that worldly sorrow leads to death, but godly sorrow leads to repentance that leads to salvation. right? So godly sorrow produces repentance that leads to salvation. So worldly sorrow is where somebody experienced what Judas did, and then later on he feels bad, and then it's like instead of him repenting, he goes and kills himself, right? So, you know, I mean, that's a literal death there, but, you know, in another sense, what Paul's talking about is spiritual death. So talking about either one, right? But, you know, it leads to death, right? Whereas godly sorrow leads to repentance. Like Peter denied Jesus, but he repented, he turned from it. And then Jesus put him through the ringer. And he said in John chapter 21, you know, last chapter of John, Peter, you know, do you love me? And, you know, actually, I'll just give you the real translation. There's a contrast in the words that are used there. Jesus says, do you love me? And then he says, Lord, you know I have affection for you. You know you're my friend. That's what he really says. And then he says, Peter, well, he says, you know, feed my lambs, I think. But anyway, I want to draw emphasis on contrasting the word that means friend or affection, and even a variation of that word that means holy kiss, versus the word that Jesus uses. The first two times he asks him, he says, do you love me? He uses agapo, right? Agape, you probably heard that word before. That's the noun version. But, you know, so he asks him, do you love me? And then, you know, Peter says, Lord, you know you're my friend. You know I have affection for you. You know you're near and dear to me, basically is what he responded. And then he asked him a second time. He's like, Peter, do you love me? And then he says, same sort of thing. He says, Lord, you know I have affection for you. You know you're dear to me. And then, you know, he said, the first time I think he said, feed my lambs. The second time I think he said, feed my sheep. But then the third time he asked him, now Jesus, for whatever reason, came down to that level and says, you know, Peter, are you my friend? And of course, Jesus, you know, it says Peter felt really bad and everything because he asked him the third time, because he knew that was comparable to what he did. He denied him 3 times. And Jesus even prophesied that he was going to deny him 3 times, and it happened just like that. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because, you know, Jesus said that in John chapter 14 and John chapter 15, that those that love him obey him, right? And even in John chapter 15 verse 14, he says, you are my friends, using that word there. You know, he says, first you love me, you obey my commandments, you obey what I say, you obey my word. So if you don't, so many of my videos I talk about these same verses because they're so important. John chapter 14 verse 15, verse 21, and verse 23. He's talking about his teachings, his commandments. He's not talking about Moses's. He's talking about his. That's what the text says. We don't have to create theology to turn it into Moses. It's talking about what Jesus commanded and said. The New Testament, the Gospels are loaded with commandments of Jesus. It's not like Jesus didn't command anything. He commanded a lot of things. He used the imperative mood of the verb a lot of times. So he's given commandments. In fact, he used the word my commandments quite often. And he said many times my word and stuff. So Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is one place where it's just loaded with his commandments. And it says at the very end of it that the wise man puts into practice what I just preached and the foolish man doesn't and stuff. So, but anyway, all that to say that in John chapter 15 verse 14, you are my friends if you do whatever I tell you. And I think that's what Jesus was talking about when he said, are you my friend? And he said, basically he was saying, what did I tell you? The night that I went to the cross, like moments before I got betrayed, I said, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you. So when he says in John chapter 21, that third time, are you my friend? He says, you know, so the implication there was clearly, you know, and do whatever I command you. I told you to feed my lambs and feed my sheep. So please do it, you know. You would be wise to do so, kind of thing. So anyway, share that with you. God bless you all.